March 7, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. First Lieutenant John Grimball of the 714th Tank Battalion guided his M26 Pershing across the Rhine River, the 90mm gun traversing slowly as his crew scanned for German positions on the eastern bank. The Pershing had arrived in Europe just weeks earlier, America's answer to years of complaints about inadequate firepower against German heavy armor. What German tank commanders didn't yet know was that this 42-ton tank, mounting a high-velocity 90mm gun, could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, distances where German crews had grown accustomed to fighting with near impunity against standard American tanks. The psychological impact of this capability would prove as devastating as its kinetic energy, shattering German assumptions about maintaining defensive superiority through superior armor protection and forcing a fundamental reassessment of tactical doctrine in the war's final weeks. The story of how American ordnance finally fielded a heavy tank capable of defeating German armor at long range begins not with battlefield necessity, but with bureaucratic resistance and doctrinal inflexibility that delayed deployment for over 2 years. In early 1943, the United States Army possessed neither the tanks nor the ammunition to reliably engage German heavy armor at ranges beyond point-blank distance. The M4 Sherman, despite its excellent reliability and automotive engineering, mounted guns that could not penetrate Tiger or Panther frontal armor, except at suicidal ranges. The M3 75mm gun that armed most Shermans could not defeat a Tiger's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The improved M1 76mm gun, deployed beginning in mid-1944, struggled against heavy German armor even with specialized tungsten core ammunition. American Army ground forces, led by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, had committed to tank destroyer doctrine that separated anti-tank capability from tank battalions. Tanks existed to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, while specialized tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. This division of roles meant that American tank crews faced German Tigers and Panthers with guns inadequate for the engagement, forced to call for tank destroyer support or attempt desperate flanking maneuvers. The doctrine looked sound on paper but collapsed under combat conditions, where German heavy tanks engaged American armor at ranges where the slower, less protected tank destroyers could not effectively respond. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Development of what would become the M26 Pershing began in earnest in 1943, but traveled a tortuous path through competing requirements, doctrinal disputes, and bureaucratic obstruction that delayed combat deployment until the war's final months. The Ordnance Department had tested heavy tank prototypes since 1942, including the 38-ton T-20 series that mounted a 76mm gun in a larger turret with improved armor protection. Testing in early 1943 revealed that even this upgraded design could not reliably defeat German heavy armor at combat ranges. Engineers needed a more powerful gun, thicker armor, and substantial redesign to create a tank capable of engaging Tigers on equal terms. The T-25 and T-26 prototypes emerged from this requirement, mounting a new high-velocity 90mm gun derived from anti-aircraft weapons but adapted for anti-tank use. The T-26 specifically incorporated thick frontal armor, reaching 102mm on the turret front and 101mm on the hull glacis, at 46 degrees of slope, providing effective protection exceeding 150mm against direct fire. The vehicle weighed 42 tons, substantially heavier than the 33-ton Sherman, but still lighter than the 57-ton Tiger. The 90mm M3 gun provided muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second with armor-piercing rounds, delivering kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate 188mm of armor at 1,000 yards at 0 degrees obliquity. This penetration capability meant the Pershing could defeat a Tiger's 100mm frontal armor at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards under ideal conditions, with reliable penetration guaranteed at 2,000 yards, even accounting for obliquity and practical combat variables. German Tiger crews, accustomed to engaging Shermans from positions where return fire posed no threat, would face an American tank that could kill them from distances they had considered safe throughout the previous 2 years of combat. Operations. Despite the T-26's clear superiority over existing Sherman variants, Army ground forces resisted deployment through most of 1944. General McNair, killed in Normandy in July 1944 by American bombs during Operation Cobra, had consistently opposed heavy tank development as unnecessary given tank destroyer doctrine. His death did not immediately change institutional resistance to deploying heavy tanks. The Armored Board at Fort Knox recommended against standardization, arguing that the T-26 offered insufficient advantages over the 76mm Sherman to justify production disruption and training complications. Field commanders in Europe, meanwhile, desperately requested better tanks as German Panthers and Tigers dominated engagements through superior firepower and armor protection. General Eisenhower personally requested heavier tanks with more powerful guns following reports from Normandy fighting in July and August 1944. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group, reported in August that the 76mm Sherman could not reliably penetrate German heavy armor and urgently needed replacement with more capable vehicles. These field requests met continued resistance from ordnance bureaucracy that prioritized production continuity over combat effectiveness, unwilling to disrupt Sherman manufacturing even as crews died in tanks inadequate for their mission. The breakthrough came not from military channels but from political pressure and public relations concerns. Secretary of War Henry Stimson intervened personally after newspaper reports highlighted American tank deficiencies and casualties suffered fighting superior German armor. Stimson ordered the War Department to accelerate heavy tank deployment regardless of doctrinal objections or production concerns. In November 1944, the Ordnance Committee finally standardized the T-26E3 as the heavy tank M26, named Pershing after General John J. Pershing, commander of American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Production authorization came in November 1944, but manufacturing capacity remained limited. Grand Blanc Arsenal, primarily focused on Sherman production, retooled slowly to accommodate the heavier, more complex vehicle. The first production M26 rolled off assembly lines in late November 1944. By January 1945, production reached only 40 vehicles per month as workers learned new procedures and suppliers struggled to provide specialized components. The Ford Motor Company GAF-5-8 engine that powered the Pershing was also used in later Sherman variants, simplifying logistics but limiting available supply. The transmission, final drives, and suspension all required new manufacturing processes that could not simply scale up from Sherman production lines. The 90mm M3 gun underwent parallel development, evolving from anti-aircraft weapons that had proven highly effective against ground targets but required modification for tank mounting. The M3 used a vertical sliding breech block derived from anti-aircraft design, differing from the traditional horizontal sliding block used in most tank guns. This configuration allowed faster loading in the confined turret space, but required specialized training for crews accustomed to Sherman 75 and 76mm guns. The gun's performance exceeded anything previously fielded by American armor. Standard M82 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds achieved muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, delivering penetrating power that finally matched or exceeded German heavy tank guns. The M82 projectile weighed 24.4 pounds, substantially heavier than the 15-pound 76mm projectile, but still manageable for loaders working in the spacious Pershing turret. The round's ballistic cap streamlined the projectile for better velocity retention at range, while the armor-piercing cap behind it ensured effective penetration rather than shattering on impact with face-hardened armor. German tank designers had pioneered these features in their armor-piercing ammunition, but American ordnance had finally caught up by late 1944, applying lessons learned through 3 years of studying captured German rounds and combat reports. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland during late 1944 and early 1945 confirmed the 90mm gun's devastating effectiveness against German armour. Engineers fired M82 rounds at captured German tank hulls positioned at various ranges and angles. Against Panther glacis armour sloped at 55 degrees with effective thickness of 140mm, the 90mm achieved reliable penetration at 1,000 yards. Against Tiger, frontal armour of 100mm at near, vertical angle, penetration was guaranteed at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, with successful penetrations recorded at 2,500 yards under test conditions. The psychological implications for German tank crews would be profound once Pershings reached combat in sufficient numbers. Tiger commanders had learned through 2 years of combat that their frontal armour was effectively immune to American tank fire at ranges beyond a few hundred yards. They positioned their vehicles accordingly, occupying hull-down positions that exposed only the heavily armoured turret, while keeping commanders aware they were safe from American guns at typical engagement ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards. A Pershing engaging at 2,000 yards would destroy that sense of invulnerability instantly, forcing German crews to reconsider every tactical assumption about fighting American armour. But delivering Pershings to combat units required overcoming massive logistical challenges beyond simply manufacturing vehicles. Each Pershing weighed 42 tons, substantially heavier than the 33-ton M4A3 Sherman that defined American armour logistics. Standard tank transporters struggled with the additional weight. Port facilities designed to handle Sherman offloading needed modification to accommodate heavier vehicles. Rail cars throughout the European theatre required weight limit verification before transporting Pershings inland from ports. These practical considerations delayed deployment even after vehicles became available in the United States. The first 20 Pershings shipped to Europe in January 1945 aboard transport vessels that docked in Antwerp, Belgium, the primary supply port for Allied forces following its liberation in November 1944. The vehicles arrived without crews specifically trained on the new tank, without adequate spare parts, stocks, and without technical manuals that had been distributed widely enough for maintenance personnel to prepare properly. Ordnance officers in Europe faced the challenge of integrating a completely new vehicle type into combat operations, with minimal preparation time and almost no prior experience maintaining or operating the design. The 3rd Armoured Division received the first Pershings assigned to combat units, with vehicles arriving at the division's maintenance areas in early February 1945. Crews selected for the new tanks included experienced Sherman veterans who could be retrained quickly on the unfamiliar vehicle. The similarities to Sherman operation helped reduce training time, as both tanks used similar driver controls, comparable steering systems, and familiar automotive layouts, despite the Pershing's greater size and weight. The primary differences centered on the 90mm gun operation, ammunition handling for the larger rounds, and tactical employment of a vehicle that could finally engage German heavy armour at ranges Shermans could never attempt. Tank commanders receiving Pershings learned their vehicles possessed capabilities that fundamentally changed tactical options against German armour. The 90mm gun's effective range meant Pershing commanders could engage Tigers before German guns could reliably penetrate Pershing armour. The psychological advantage of firing first from a protected position while the enemy remained vulnerable represented a complete reversal of the tactical situation American tankers had endured since first encountering Tigers in Tunisia. During 1943, crews who had spent 2 years maneuvering desperately for flank shots or calling for tank destroyer support could now engage German heavy armour directly with reasonable confidence of achieving penetration before receiving effective return fire. The tactical employment doctrine for Pershings evolved rapidly during February 1945 as units gained combat experience with the new vehicles. Initial guidance treated Pershings as specialized tank destroyers, holding them in reserve to respond to German armor threats, rather than committing them to general infantry support missions, where their superior armor and firepower would be wasted. This approach maximized the Pershing's anti-armor capability, but frustrated crews who wanted to exploit their vehicles' advantages more aggressively. Field commanders quickly learned that Pershings performed effectively in breakthrough roles, using their thick armor to lead attacks through defended positions, while their 90mm guns destroyed fortifications and suppressed German anti-tank weapons. By late February 1945, roughly 70 Pershings had reached combat units in Europe, distributed primarily among 1st and 3rd Army formations preparing for the final offensives into Germany. The 9th Armoured Division's 14th Tank Battalion received several Pershings just before the surprise capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th. Lieutenant Grimball's Pershing, one of 3 in the battalion, was among the first American tanks to cross the Rhine when engineers declared the damaged bridge safe for limited armoured traffic. The psychological impact on German defenders who watched these heavy American tanks crossing into Germany proper cannot be understated, representing tangible proof that American industrial capacity had finally produced armour equivalent to Germany's best. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German perspective on American tank development through 1944 had been one of qualified confidence that technical superiority in armour and firepower would partially compensate for numerical disadvantage and declining operational flexibility. Intelligence reports noted increasing numbers of 76mm Shermans, but correctly assessed that this gun remained inferior to German heavy tank armament and could not reliably penetrate Tiger or Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. Reports of new American ammunition types, including tungsten core projectiles, caused concern, but did not fundamentally alter German confidence that Panther and Tiger crews could engage American armor from ranges where return fire posed minimal threat. The appearance of Pershings in early 1945, therefore, came as an unwelcome strategic surprise to German armor commanders who had not anticipated American deployment of true heavy tanks comparable to German vehicles in protection and firepower. German intelligence had tracked T-26 development through various sources, including interrogation of American prisoners, technical journals published before direct censorship, and neutral country observers, but assessment focused on development programs rather than imminent combat deployment. The rapid shift from prototype to combat operations caught German planning completely unprepared for the tactical implications. The first combat engagement between a Pershing and German armour occurred on February 26, 1945, near the German town of Elsdorf, approximately 20 kilometers west of Cologne. A Pershing from Company F, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division engaged a Panzer IV at approximately 800 yards. The German tank, positioned behind earthworks defending the approach to the town, opened fire first as the Pershing rounded a bend in the road. The Panzer IV's 75mm round struck the Pershing's frontal armour and ricocheted harmlessly, the German crew watching in apparent disbelief as their shot failed to penetrate. The Pershing's gunner returned fire immediately. The 90mm M82 round struck the Panzer IV's turret front, penetrating cleanly and detonating the ammunition stored inside. The German tank exploded, its turret lifting slightly from the force of secondary explosions before settling back onto the chassis. The entire engagement lasted fewer than 30 seconds, but demonstrated conclusively what testing data had predicted. The Pershing could absorb hits from German medium tank guns, while its own weapon destroyed enemy armor with single shots at ranges where German crews expected to fight safely. Word of the engagement spread rapidly through 3rd Armoured Division, with crews eager to hear details about the new tank's performance. The Pershing had taken a direct hit from a gun that would have penetrated a Sherman's frontal armor and suffered only superficial damage to the paint. The 90mm gun had destroyed a German tank with one shot at a range where Sherman crews would have struggled to achieve penetration, even with high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. For American tankers who had spent months watching German tanks engage them from positions where return fire was ineffective, the Pershing represented validation that American industry could finally produce vehicles matching German capabilities. The most famous Pershing engagement occurred on March 6, 1945, in the devastated streets of Cologne. The city, Germany's fourth largest with a pre-war population exceeding 700,000, had been reduced to ruins by sustained Allied bombing that destroyed over 90% of the central district. American forces of the 1st Infantry Division and 3rd Armored Division fought through rubble-choked streets against determined German defenders, who used the ruins as defensive positions. Panzerfaust-equipped infantry teams ambushed American tanks from cellars and upper floors, while German armor positioned in concealed locations engaged American vehicles at point-blank range, where superior German firepower could penetrate even frontal armor. Pershing No. 26, nicknamed Eagle 7, and commanded by Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik of the 3rd Armored Division's 32nd Armored Regiment, moved through Cologne's streets as part of E Company's advance toward the cathedral in the city centre. The massive Gothic structure, miraculously still standing despite surrounding devastation, served as a navigation landmark visible from most positions in the city. Mashlonik's crew proceeded cautiously, aware that German defenders had destroyed several American tanks in the preceding hours, using ambush tactics that negated American advantages in firepower and numbers. At approximately 1300 hours, Eagle 7 turned onto Marzellenstrasse, a wide boulevard leading toward the cathedral square. Cameraman Jim Bates, of the attached combat camera unit, filmed from a following Sherman, documenting the Pershing's advance through the ruins. Approximately 200 yards ahead, partially concealed behind rubble from a collapsed building, a German Panther OSF-G waited in ambush. The Panther crew had positioned their tank carefully, keeping the hull hidden while exposing only the turret and gun, presenting the smallest possible target while maintaining ability to engage targets on the approach route. The Panther fired first, its 75mm round striking Eagle 7's right front fender. The hit damaged the fender but failed to penetrate the hull armor beneath, the German crew discovering what Panzer IV crews had learned weeks earlier. American armor could now absorb hits from German guns that had dominated previous engagements. Mashlonik's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had been scanning constantly for threats and immediately identified the Panther's muzzle flash through the rubble. His response came within seconds, the 90mm gun traversing onto target as the loader slammed an M82 round into the breech. Smoyer fired at near point-blank range for the 90mm capabilities, fewer than 200 yards separating the two tanks. The American round struck the Panther's gun mantlet, the impact point clearly visible on Bates's film footage as a bright flash followed by smoke. The tungsten carbide penetrator punched through the curved cast steel mantlet and detonated ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther's interior became an inferno instantly, flames erupting from every opening as stored ammunition cooked off in rapid succession. The crew, 5 men trapped in the burning vehicle, died within seconds, overcome by flames and explosive force before they could attempt escape. The film footage captured the entire engagement, from the Panther's first shot through the catastrophic destruction of the German tank. Combat cameraman Bates continued filming as Eagle 7 advanced past the burning Panther, the footage providing dramatic visual proof of Pershing capability that would be analyzed extensively in post-war studies. The engagement demonstrated several critical factors about Pershing effectiveness. The thick frontal armor absorbed a 75mm hit that would have penetrated a Sherman. The 90mm gun destroyed a Panther with a single frontal hit at close range, something Sherman crews could accomplish only with specialized ammunition under favorable conditions. Most importantly, the crew's training and experience translated effectively to the new vehicle, with Smoyer engaging and destroying the threat within seconds of taking fire. The psychological impact of the Cologne engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical result. German tank crews throughout the Western Front learned through fragmented reports and scattered survivor accounts that American armor now included heavy tanks comparable to Panthers in protection and firepower. The specific knowledge that a Pershing had destroyed a Panther in direct frontal engagement, the exact scenario where German crews had maintained consistent superiority throughout 1944, fundamentally altered German confidence in their remaining tactical advantages. German intelligence officers interrogating American prisoners captured during March 1945 operations specifically inquired about the new heavy tanks appearing in combat. Prisoners reported that the vehicles were called Pershings, mounted 90mm guns, and possessed armor protection that German anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate frontally. This information reached higher headquarters through intelligence summaries that painted an increasingly grim picture of American material advantages, overwhelming German defenders. Despite continued individual German tactical proficiency, the Panther crew that died in Cologne represented the broader German predicament in the war's final months. Their tank, technically sophisticated and well-designed, provided inadequate advantage against an enemy deploying vehicles of comparable capability, supported by overwhelming artillery, complete air superiority, and logistics that German forces could not match. The crew had positioned well, fired first, and still died within seconds because American armor could finally absorb their fire and respond with devastating effect. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements during March and April 1945, as German resistance collapsed under combined pressure from advancing Allied forces on all fronts. Additional Pershing deployments through March and early April 1945 provided expanding combat data about the vehicle's capabilities and limitations under actual battlefield conditions. The 9th Armoured Division employed Pershings during expansion of the Remagen bridgehead, using the heavy tanks to lead attacks against German counterattacks, attempting to destroy the bridge or contain the Allied penetration across the Rhine. Pershings absorbed fire from German 75mm anti-tank guns positioned in prepared defences, their thick armour providing protection that allowed aggressive advances that would have been suicidal for Sherman crews. The 76mm gun on the Panther, the same weapon that had dominated American armour throughout 1944, now faced a vehicle it could not reliably penetrate frontally at combat ranges. German crews accustomed to fighting confidently from hull-down positions found that Pershing 90mm guns could defeat their armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, forcing more cautious tactics and defensive positioning that surrendered initiative to American forces. This psychological reversal, combined with deteriorating German logistics, fuel shortages, and collapsing command structure, contributed to accelerating German military defeat in the war's final weeks. Pershing crews quickly learned the tactical advantages and limitations of their vehicles through sustained combat operations. The advantages were substantial and immediately apparent. The armor protection exceeded anything previously available to American tank crews, with frontal armor capable of defeating German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical combat ranges. The 90mm gun provided firepower adequate for engaging any German armoured vehicle with confidence of achieving penetration. The spacious turret accommodated the crew comfortably with excellent visibility through periscopes and cupola, allowing commanders to maintain situational awareness in close terrain. The limitations became equally apparent with extended operations. The Ford GAF engine, while reliable and powerful, provided marginal power-to-weight ratio for the 42-ton vehicle. The Pershing's 11.6 horsepower per ton compared unfavorably to the Sherman's 15.8 horsepower per ton, resulting in reduced acceleration and cross-country mobility. Crews found their Pershings slower to respond than Shermans in fluid combat situations, requiring rapid position changes. The transmission, derived from earlier Sherman designs, proved adequate but not optimal for the increased weight, with drivers reporting that gear changes required more careful throttle management to avoid mechanical stress. The tracks, using the same basic design as late-model Shermans, distributed the vehicle's weight over a larger surface area, but still resulted in higher ground pressure than Sherman. Crews operating in soft soil conditions found their Pershings more prone to bogging down than lighter vehicles, limiting tactical flexibility in certain terrain types. These mobility limitations, while not crippling, reminded crews that the Pershing represented a compromise between protection, firepower, and automotive performance, rather than a vehicle optimized equally in all characteristics. Ammunition stowage provided 70 rounds of 90mm ammunition, substantially fewer than the Sherman's 87 rounds of 76mm or 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition. Crews learned to manage their ammunition carefully during extended engagements, aware that resupply might not be immediately available in fluid combat situations. The larger, heavier 90mm rounds also required more physical effort to handle, with loaders working harder than Sherman loaders, despite the Pershing's more spacious turret providing better working conditions. By mid-April 1945, approximately 200 Pershings had reached combat units in Europe, distributed among 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 9th Armies, as additional vehicles completed production and shipping. This force represented a tiny fraction of American armor strength, with Sherman variants still comprising over 95% of deployed tanks, but the psychological impact exceeded the modest numbers. German defenders knew American forces now fielded heavy tanks comparable to their own, eliminating one of Germany's few remaining tactical advantages in armored warfare. The strategic situation by April 1945 had deteriorated beyond recovery for German forces, regardless of equipment, quality, or crew training. American and British forces, advancing from the west, had crossed the Rhine along multiple fronts, encircling German Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket and advancing rapidly toward central Germany. Soviet forces attacking from the east had shattered German defensive lines and were advancing toward Berlin through collapsing resistance. German industry, devastated by years of strategic bombing and loss of territory containing critical resources, could no longer sustain military operations at any meaningful scale. Panther and Tiger production, which had peaked at over 300 tanks per month during 1944, had collapsed to barely 100 vehicles monthly by March 1945, with quality control problems rendering many newly produced tanks mechanically unreliable. Fuel shortages meant that operational tanks often sat immobilized for lack of gasoline or diesel, with German units forced to abandon serviceable vehicles simply because they lacked fuel to operate them. The Pershing, arriving in this context, represented American industrial capacity to develop, produce, and deploy new weapons systems while simultaneously sustaining existing production at levels Germany could never match. The comparison between Pershing and Tiger capabilities deserves examination beyond simple statistics, as the two vehicles represented fundamentally different design philosophies applied to similar requirements. The Tiger, developed during 1941 and entering combat in late 1942, prioritized firepower and armor protection over mobility and reliability. Its 88mm gun, derived from the legendary Flak 18 anti-aircraft weapon, provided devastating performance against any Allied armor encountered through 1944. Its armor, reaching 100mm on the frontal surfaces and 80mm on the armor and the sides, made the Tiger nearly invulnerable to frontal attack by Allied tanks at combat ranges. But the Tiger's 57-ton weight stressed every automotive component, requiring a complex transmission with 8 forward gears and sophisticated steering system using separate radius rods for each track. The Maybach HL 230 engine, producing 700 horsepower, provided adequate power but demanded constant maintenance and careful operation to avoid mechanical failures. Field commanders learned to transport Tigers by rail whenever possible, as sustained road marches consumed limited engine life and risked transmission failures that would immobilize the vehicle far from repair facilities. The Pershing, by contrast, applied American automotive engineering principles to heavy tank design, prioritizing reliability and ease of maintenance alongside firepower and protection. The Ford GAF engine, though providing less horsepower than the Maybach, required minimal specialized maintenance and proved highly reliable under field conditions. The transmission, though derived from Sherman designs that were not optimal for the heavier vehicle, rarely suffered catastrophic failures and could be field repaired by mechanics with standard tools and basic training. The entire vehicle reflected design philosophy that accepted slightly reduced performance in exchange for dramatically improved reliability and maintainability. In direct combat between Pershing and Tiger, the outcome would depend heavily on engagement conditions rather than inherent vehicle superiority. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate Pershing frontal armor at ranges under 1,000 yards, while the Pershing's 90mm gun could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. This range advantage favored the Pershing in open terrain, where superior American fire control and optical equipment could exploit longer engagement distances. In close terrain, where combat occurred at ranges under 500 yards, the Tiger's slightly superior armor and gun performance provided marginal advantages. The practical reality was that by the time Pershings reached combat in meaningful numbers, Tigers were increasingly rare on Western Front battlefields. Production had ended in August 1944 after 1,347 vehicles built, with surviving examples scattered among depleted units, struggling with fuel shortages and mechanical failures. Pershings were far more likely to encounter Panthers, which they could defeat reliably at combat ranges, or older Panzer IV medium tanks that posed minimal threat to Pershing armor. The few recorded engagements between Pershings and Tigers occurred during April 1945 operations in central Germany, with results consistent with expected performance based on vehicle capabilities. A Pershing from the 14th Tank Battalion engaged and destroyed a Tiger at approximately 1,200 yards during fighting near Dessau on April 12. The 90mm round penetrated the Tiger's frontal armor, causing ammunition detonation that killed the crew and destroyed the vehicle. The Tiger had been positioned in a hull-down location but failed to engage the Pershing before being destroyed, possibly due to crew inexperience or mechanical problems, preventing rapid gun traverse. German tank crews interviewed after the war consistently noted that American fire control equipment provided significant advantages in target acquisition and engagement speed. The Pershing's gunner's periscope, coupled with the gyro-stabilized gun-laying equipment adapted from earlier Sherman designs, allowed rapid engagement of targets identified by the commander. German tanks lacked comparable stabilization, requiring gunners to lay weapons manually, using mechanical, elevating and traversing handwheels, while accounting for vehicle motion and range estimation errors. This technical difference, seemingly minor, translated into American crews engaging targets several seconds faster than German crews under comparable conditions. The Pershing's combat debut, though limited to the war's final months, validated the vehicle's design and demonstrated that American industry could produce tanks comparable to German heavy armor when doctrinal and bureaucratic obstacles were overcome. The 90mm gun provided firepower adequate for defeating any German tank at reasonable combat ranges. The armor protection, though not invulnerable, exceeded anything previously available to American crews and allowed aggressive tactics that would have been suicidal in Sherman's. The automotive reliability, applying lessons from 2 years of Sherman development, ensured that Pershings reached battlefields and completed missions without the mechanical failures that plagued German heavy tanks. The post-war analysis by American ordnance officers and armor commanders reached consensus that Pershing deployment should have occurred 12 to 18 months earlier than actual combat introduction. Had Pershings been available during the Normandy campaign in summer 1944, American tank casualties would have been substantially lower and tactical flexibility significantly enhanced. The delays resulting from doctrinal disputes and bureaucratic resistance represented failures of military planning that cost American lives unnecessarily and allowed German forces to exploit tactical advantages in armor quality long after. American industry possessed the capability to produce competitive vehicles. The German perspective, gathered from post-war interrogations and examination of captured documents, revealed that German tank designers recognized American industrial advantages, but remained confident that technical sophistication and tactical proficiency would partially compensate through the war's final year. The appearance of Pershings in early 1945 shattered this confidence, demonstrating that American industry had overcome its previous limitations in heavy tank design and could produce vehicles matching German capabilities while simultaneously maintaining Sherman production at levels Germany could never approach with its limited industrial capacity. The lessons learned from Pershing development and combat employment directly influenced American tank design through the Cold War era and beyond. The M26 remained in service through the Korean War, where its 90mm gun proved devastatingly effective against Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks employed by North Korean and Chinese forces. The combat experience in Korea validated the vehicle's basic design while revealing areas requiring improvement, particularly in automotive performance, where the marginally powered Pershing struggled in Korean terrain. The M46, M47, and M48 tanks that succeeded the Pershing incorporated progressively more powerful engines and improved transmissions, while retaining the basic hull and turret configuration proven in combat. The M60 main battle tank, introduced in 1960, represented the final evolution of the Pershing's design lineage, mounting a British-developed 105mm gun in an enlarged turret on a chassis descended directly from the M26. The continuity from Pershing through M60 demonstrated that the basic design decisions made during World War II remained sound for over 2 decades of tank development. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, which replaced the M60 in American service during the 1980s, incorporated lessons learned from the Pershing's combat debut and subsequent development. The emphasis on automotive excellence, providing mobility comparable to lighter vehicles despite heavy armor protection, reflected recognition that Pershing mobility limitations had constrained tactical employment. The powerful 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine gave the 70-ton Abrams superior power-to-weight ratio compared to the Pershing, allowing aggressive maneuver warfare that the heavier but less mobile earlier vehicle could not sustain. The Cologne engagement between Maschlonik's Pershing and the German Panther remained one of the most famous tank duels of World War II, preserved on film and analyzed extensively in post-war military education. The footage showed clearly how American armor had finally achieved parity with German heavy tanks in a direct frontal engagement, the psychological impact extending far beyond the immediate tactical result. For American tankers who had fought through North Africa, Italy, France, and into Germany facing superior German armor with inadequate weapons, the Pershing represented validation that their industrial base could produce competitive equipment when properly motivated. The crew members who fought in Cologne, particularly gunner Clarence Smoyer, became representative figures for the broader story of American armor development during World War II. Smoyer's post-war interviews emphasized not the technical specifications or industrial achievement, but the personal relief of finally possessing a tank that could fight German armor without requiring desperate tactical maneuvers or overwhelming numerical superiority. For crews who had watched friends die in Shermans destroyed by German guns they could not effectively return fire against, the Pershing provided both practical capability and psychological reassurance that they could survive combat against heavy German armor. The final accounting of Pershing combat performance revealed that approximately 310 vehicles reached Europe before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, with roughly 200 seeing actual combat operations. 20 Pershings were lost to all causes during combat operations, representing a loss rate substantially lower than Sherman casualties during comparable periods. The favorable loss rate reflected both superior armor protection and the limited intensity of combat during the war's final weeks as German resistance collapsed across all fronts. The strategic impact of Pershing deployment remained limited by small numbers and late introduction, with the vehicle appearing too late to influence major campaigns or alter operational outcomes. The psychological impact, however, extended beyond tactical results. German commanders learned that American industrial capacity could respond to technical challenges and field competitive weapons systems despite earlier weaknesses. American crews learned that their industrial base would eventually provide adequate equipment when combat conditions demanded it. These lessons influenced post-war military planning and doctrine development on both sides of the emerging Cold War divide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.